Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being in community with us today. I'm Zara Ahmed, and I'll be co-facilitating today's session with my colleague, Carrie Foley. And it's my honor that we are joined by faculty Christina Villarreal, who goes by V, George Soroka, and Mira Levinson, who will share their insights into facilitating discussions around opposing views. And as part of my work as a faculty development specialist in the Division of Continuing Education, I support instructors to navigate critical conversations with students online and in hybrid and in-person classroom settings. And I'm now going to pass it to Carrie to introduce herself.
Thanks, Zara. So thanks everyone for being here. We're really excited for today's conversation. I'm Carrie Foley. I am the Director of Online Pedagogy and Course Design at Harvard Extension School, and I use she, her pronouns. So my team partners closely with faculty at Extension, Summer School, and our executive education branch to work on targeted projects, to design fully online courses, to offer consultations in collaboration with Zara and her team. And we get asked all the time questions around how do I facilitate, how do I structure, how do I intervene? And I'm also an instructor, and I think about this stuff all the time for my own course. So when I saw this on the agenda, I immediately signed up and asked if I could facilitate because I wanted to make sure I learned as much as I can. So I am not only a facilitator, but I am also a learner in the same seat as you all. So very excited to be here, and I'll pass it back to you, Zara.
Our hope is that today's panel is fun and interactive, and that you'll have a chance to both listen and ask questions. I'm now going to put in a quick agenda in our chat box. And so we're going to start off with brief faculty introductions, followed by a faculty showcase of case studies. And then we're going to end our time with a Q&A for you to ask questions to the faculty, and we'll have a closure for us to recap our learnings from our conversation. Now I'm really excited to introduce our faculty panelists, and I'm now going to pass it to each of them to introduce themselves. So V, I'm handing it off to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me and having us. I'm V, and lecturer at the Graduate School of Education, and teach courses on ethnic studies and healing-centered engagements.
Thank you, V. I'm going to pass it to George.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is George Soroka. I am a lecturer on government and also the Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies in my department. I've been at Harvard for way longer than I care to admit. Got my PhD from here in 2014, and I teach primarily religion and politics, propaganda, those nice non-contentious courses, and also East European politics.
And one thing we forgot to mention at the start is that Dr. Mira Levinson is joining us as well. However, she is coming from class, and so she had already told us in advance she'd be a few minutes late. So I'm here. Oh, Mira. Hey, excellent. We were just doing introductions.
Hi, I'm Mira Levinson. I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm a political theorist by training, and I was a middle school teacher by practice for about a decade. And I do work on civic education and educational ethics.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for running from class to join us, Mira. Really appreciate it. We're really excited to have all three of you here to teach us and to help us think about these topics and how we can participate in these conversations. Hopefully both as facilitators, but also when we are actually participating in these discussions as learners as well. So we asked each of the panelists here if they would be willing to prepare an example or a case study, or just otherwise share some of their wisdom around facilitating these topics, these conversations in their own courses. And so we've asked them, we're giving them each about 5 to 6 minutes if they don't mind, and we're going to start V with you, and we're going to ask you to just come off of mute and share a little bit about what you do and how you do this work, and if possible, any strategies that you have that you can share with the group would be wonderful as well. Thanks, V.
Thanks so much, Carrie. For me, when I was asked to think about a case study, and even in thinking about facilitating discussions, I will be honest, it's not that I have a direct, oh, now we're going to have a hot button discussion. I'm sure that like George and Mira feel the same. Usually these things just happen. And what are the things that we already have in place? And so what I would like to maybe talk about is my approach to trying to co-construct and cultivate a learning community that is rooted in what I call a healing centered mind and heart set. Again, as I mentioned, I teach courses on ethnic studies, healing centered engagement. And when we're discussing, when topics, center on issues of how racialized trauma, oppression, white body supremacy, how they show up in our bodies, that extends beyond an intellectual exercise. So when different views or opposing views come up in that regard, it's actually very embodied, no matter what your background is. And so I would invite, so some of the things I might ask, from the very beginning classes to think about, and I'd invite everyone who's listening to think about what are certain topics. When have you been in discussion when you feel your muscles constrict? When do you feel your muscles relax? And so beginning, I think just the classes in those first few weeks and building community and recognizing the ways in which, so one of the healing heart sets that we have is seeking to understand. How I define that is asking everyone, to engage in individual and collective empathetic struggle, to reflect on the ways in which your positionality is supporting or impeding your ability to understand the words, feelings, and thoughts of another person. I think putting that, when I think about, discussions where, opposition occurs, conflict, I ask also for honesty, speaking your truth, holding and honoring the truths of those around you, and the tension and reality that multiple truths exist in both community and conflict. Oftentimes when we talk about community, there's this, I think, misconception that means everyone is getting along. That actually community is actually a very messy process. Organizing, grassroots organizing is a very messy process, and conflict is inevitable. So I don't open my classes saying that we want to avoid conflict, when in fact, it's an expectation. It is going to happen, and how we show up in those conflicts is less about it happening and more about a willingness to have an approach to conversations where you can name your needs, where you can name if you feel harmed, and then if you can accept accountability, where if your viewpoint, I think it's inevitable that some viewpoints may actually cause harm to another person. And I think, again, it's not about avoiding that. That is a reality, a painful reality of our society. And it's less about, can you move towards, what does it mean then to see, to embrace a heart set of understanding and of repair if and when harm occurs. The last one I want to talk about is respect and how we define it or seek to define it in my classroom. Working to respect the thoughts, feelings, ideas, beliefs, and needs of yourself and others. So again, this goes back to recognizing, when do your palms start sweating? When do you feel nervous? And how is that tied to your unique set of lived experiences, background, expertise, and experiences in education? And that recognize that what may feel safe for one person may feel very dangerous for another. And that includes, the ways in which we might engage in dialogue. So we also kind of call into question ideas and notions of safety. Again, we do all of this before the topics come up. We spend time in the beginning asking students to think about, all right, even as you go through these heart sets, which ones do you feel, do you already feel, this one comes easily for me? Which one is a struggle for you? Asking them to talk to each other. And sometimes actually the debates around the heart sets come up. And I think that's a healthy, it's like a healthy primer for when actual maybe conflict and discussion occurs later on in the semester. I think, I wasn't keeping a timer, but I wanted to, that was what I was going to offer in terms of my case study is how we try to set that tone from the very beginning.
Thank you so much, V. I was taking a lot of notes as you were talking, and I just love the community is messy and the conflict is inevitable. You're right. Whenever I'm designing my own norm setting activities or my own community for my course, I always just try to figure out how can we get along the best way possible, right? Like how can we all become this friendly group, and reframing it in that way is actually, at least for me, already a really helpful tip. So thank you so much for sharing that and for all your tips. So thank you, V. By the way, if you have questions for the panelists, we are definitely going to open it up to Q&A in just a bit, but you're welcome to put them in the chat. We actually are a little ahead of schedule, so you kept us ahead of schedule, which is great. So we might, we will hopefully have a chance to ask to have a broader Q&A discussion later. But feel free to throw those right in the chat as they come up, and we'll make sure that we get to them. So thank you, V. I'm going to pass it over to George and ask George if you would share a little bit with us as well.
Of course. Thank you so much, Vi. I'm actually really glad you went first, because I think what you said dovetails very nicely with what I'm about to share. I have much the same approach. I want disagreement in my classroom. I always say we should disagree, but we should not be disagreeable while doing it. And I try to model this behavior, and I try to set the tone very early on that the only type of discussion we can't have is ad hominem attacks. I mean, that's completely off the table, and I will shut that down immediately if it gets to that point. But I have been a lot more deliberate, I think, in recent years. And, honestly, I think the pandemic's kind of exacerbated this. I think teaching online has made this more difficult. By this, I mean building a sense of community. So I have thought a lot more about positionality and kind of where students are coming from and who I am, and trying not to bring preconceived notions in. But realizing that, let's say, a first-generation student or a student from an underrepresented group on campus might have a very different experience, and even a very different way of engaging, or in some cases not engaging with the discussion that's going on. Having said that, again, I'm very much about setting the tone and norms. I tell people that we are a community. We don't have to always get along even, but we do have to respect one another. One of actually the issues I faced a lot in recent years is self-censorship, and I find this to be really problematic. When I started teaching, students were, in my view, much more willing to take problematic positions and kind of play with them intellectually. And now I often find, again, I teach propaganda and religion and politics, right? So courses that by their very nature are prone to disagreement and to conflict. I find that students tend to agree with one another and take what many of them would see as the least disagreeable position. I've had private conversations with students. A lot of them have said they're really afraid that what they say in the classroom will end up on social media, that they'll, quote unquote, end up being canceled. So I've actually, for the first time this year, put a contract into my syllabus that what happens in the classroom won't be repeated anywhere else on social media or outside of the classroom. They're welcome to have conversations, but they're not welcome to share what their peers said with other people who are not part of the class. I'm talking about specifics, not general ideas. One way I try to get out of this is I try to assign students to take certain positions. Then it feels much more, and I sometimes make this a group effort, then it feels much more that they're not reflecting their position, which they feel might be something that is not desirable socially in the class, but it's because I've assigned it to them to make the best argument you can. And I always say, I realize you may not agree with this, you probably don't even agree with this, but make the best intellectual case you can for this. And I flip it. So no one is in the position where it seems like they are advocating for a certain point. I make them advocate for both sides. I also do this individually with writing assignments. I try to have students put themselves in people's shoes. So one of the assignments I would do would be in my religion politics class to have them put themselves in the shoes of a religious person or an atheist and confronting an uncomfortable situation. How would they react to this in terms of a normative response? What would we want to see in a good community, in a pluralistic community? How should religion be accommodated in this sort of community, and how should lack of belief be accommodated in this sort of community? Students who take classes with me know one of my favorite expressions is, let me play the devil's advocate. I don't know how many of you know, this was actually a position in the Catholic Church. This was someone who argued against the beatification of someone. So arguing against someone's sainthood, right? That's where the term comes from, the devil's advocate. And I make very clear that I'm not necessarily putting positions out there that I personally espouse, but I'm trying to get the conversation going. What I find difficult sometimes when modeling respectful behavior is deciding how neutral to be versus realizing that on some subconscious level, my positions do, of course, influence how I teach. So that's something I'm still struggling with, to be honest with you, a little bit about how much I reveal about my own positions. Generally, I say I'm successful if students don't know what my actual beliefs are when I end the class. But I think part of being respectful to students is also answering their questions when they say, you know, Dr. Soroka, where do you stand on this? I don't know that this is the right way to do it, but so far I've generally said that's a fair question. Come to my office hours and we can have a discussion about that. Or at the end of the class, I reveal, if I think it's appropriate, a little bit more about myself, just so they feel that they know where I'm coming from. We've had a lot of discussions about interpretation of facts versus the facts themselves. I always say you can have your own interpretation of the facts, but you're not entitled to your own facts. This has been a big issue with the Trump presidency, and particularly January 6th. I try to be as neutral as possible on political stances, but I can't say that, you know, as I think it was Representative McCarthy who called the insurrection on January 6th the tourist visit, right? I mean, that's sort of where that neutrality has to end. And I think we have to assume our educational responsibility and speak the truth. I invite guest speakers with different positions. Before the pandemic, we would often go out as a class or a small group with guest speakers with different positions. And I found this to be a very non-threatening and congenial environment for students to have a conversation with someone that they might not encounter otherwise in the type of community we have at Harvard. I will, if I kind of have maybe 2 minutes left, let me address two specifics. One thing that comes up very frequently are normative ideas. So when I teach on religion and politics, or this just happened teaching my propaganda class, we talk about how religion could be viewed as propaganda. That elicits a lot of very strong reactions. When we talk about religious terrorism, that also elicits a lot of very strong reactions, usually along the lines of, well, that's not really, you know, what this religion teaches, and therefore these people aren't of this particular, they're not representatives of this particular tradition. That's always a tricky conversation to have, I think, because you're getting very close at people's deeply held beliefs. And I very much in those sort of situations try to avoid directly challenging the student. My fallback is always that we are having an intellectual discussion. This is predicated on the academic definition of what is religion, what is terrorism, what is propaganda. I make it clear that I'm not, in this particular instance, a theologian, so I'm not going to argue with them about whether, you know, someone who commits a terrible act in the name of religion actually is. I say very upfront that we are just going to assume people are who they are and are operating for these reasons, not to say that there might not be other motivating reasons here as well. But I just bring that up because that's always been a big issue in my classes, and that's probably been the most difficult position to navigate. Final thought, censorship has also been a difficult position for me. So one of the things in my class on religion and politics we talk about are the Charlie Hebdo cartoons that led to the deaths of 12 individuals on January 7th, 2016. And I've had a lot of pushback on that from students that say, you know, we shouldn't be showing this. And my response is always to kind of walk a middle ground with this, to say, you don't have to look at these cartoons. I put them several layers deep on the website to make sure no one accidentally opens something that could be offensive to them. But by the same token, I treat this as a teaching situation that it's difficult to have a conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it may make us, about what is right and what is wrong, or what is politically relevant, without actually knowing the content of what goes into this. So let me end there. I'm happy to do more in Q&A, but those were the two most fraught situations I would say I've encountered in the last decade in teaching these classes.
Thank you so much, George. Thanks for sharing those and for being brave enough to continue to teach that case, right? I think it is really important, and it seems like you are doing it in such a way that sort of protects the students that do need the extra layers, you know, the extra few clicks to get to it if they don't want to see it. So it's a great it's a great technique in and of itself. Something else that you said that I just wanted to call out because it reminded me so much of what Monica Higgins said earlier on this morning, where you said that you use the phrase, let me play devil's advocate. I love that. And it's one of the things, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sure I will say it wrong. And she said it much more eloquently, but she said that her job is to challenge assumptions and encourage disagreements. And I thought that was really cool. And that taking that ownership. I also loved the idea of assigning students to take the position, right? So you're sort of taking the burden off of the student and sort of putting it more on the position, which I thought was really great technique. So that plus many more things that I'm sure everyone else took away, but I just wanted to call out a couple. So thank you so much, George. Mira, I would love to hear from you next.
Great. Part of what I think is coming out importantly from what both V and George was mentioning is preparing the landscape of the class. And one of the things that I just find really most helpful in doing that is Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversation Compass, because I think it actually helps us think about what V was talking about, the heart set, and linking it to what so many students, particularly at a place like Harvard, engage with or think about with the mindset, and say, as George was talking about, sort of this is an intellectual space, this is an academic space. And I think it's important to recognize, yes, that is true, but how we engage with ideas, V was talking about our embodied self engaging with them. And I think it's really important to recognize and help students recognize that when we encounter really hard, challenging ideas, events, phenomena, systems, statements from classmates, right, experiences, texts, concepts, theories, right, all of these things, that there are multiple ways in which we respond to them. And that just naming those different categories of responses I find really helpful. So what you can see here is that Singleton on this Courageous Conversation Compass says, look, we are often in school spaces, again, especially a place like Harvard, trained to think that we should be thinking about this solely intellectually, that we should be responding with our head, thinking about counter arguments, supporting evidence, et cetera. And that's what many of us may do quite naturally. We may have become good at it, right? That's why we're here, et cetera. But there are other ways in which we may respond to this too. We may respond with this visceral moral feeling, right? That is really important, that is that, where our moral sensibility and our values and who we think people are, conceptions of human rights, our conceptions of ourselves are really brought in there. That others of us may, in fact, sort of lead into the work with emotion, with feeling, with our heart. And that's not an anti-intellectual stance. I think that's one of the things that's really important about this compass that I find very useful, is that in fact, when we track our emotions and our emotional responses to things, that is itself really powerful information. And if we close ourselves off from emotions, similarly, that actually closes us off from all sorts of insights that we may have and that we may gain from others as we hear about why they respond emotionally the way they do. And then others may respond to things that we're presenting in class, to statements that colleagues make or whatever, by wanting to act, right? By thinking we need to be in conversation with others now and go do. And by normalizing this range of responses to a common text, statement, et cetera, it helps to bring students into the conversation and say, okay, there's two things going on here potentially. One is you may need to sort of be aware of where is it that you're coming into this from. And if you're coming into this from a really strong, moral sensibility, it helps to name that for yourself. It helps to name it to others. And it can help you think about, okay, how do you potentially integrate the moral with, say, the intellectual work that we're expecting you to do right now. But the other piece that I think it does really helpfully with diverse students in a classroom is that it helps them recognize what their classmates may be doing and what their professor may be doing, and to recognize, oh, okay, you are responding to this from a different position, say, on this compass, right? And I can recognize that. So I am responding to this incredibly emotionally, you are responding to this incredibly analytically. And rather than my immediately rejecting your analytic response as being inhumane, say, I need to recognize, I understand one could respond to this analytically. And now let me try to figure out how I name and uncover for you why this is emotional for me and what kind of work that may do to inform your analysis and vice versa. So it helps give students some language so that it's not solely about harm or about being irrational or emotional or whatever, right? But it gives us a way to think about how do we bring in different kinds of knowledge, experiences, approaches to common course material, and then find our way into the middle. So that's something that I use sort of on the forefront often. Then I'll talk about one technique that I use sort of in the middle. That's sort of to set ourselves up for some success. In the middle, one of the things that I do as a scholar actually, and as an educator, is I create what I call these normative case studies about hard ethical issues. In my case, is hard ethical issues in education and teaching and learning and school systems and education policy, because that's my field. But they can exist in many ways. And the point of these case studies is very specifically to create spaces for conversation where, in fact, it's really unclear what one should do. And so people can't retreat into these spaces that George was talking about, where I know what it is that I'm supposed to say. And if I think something even slightly different, I might self-censor, or I might want to sort of perform my wokeness or my being countercultural or whatever it is. And so here are just two links to the website that we have on justiceinschools.org, where we have a whole bunch of case studies that are designed precisely to help people have conversations in these spaces, and where it's actually really unclear. Like we very purposefully put in the realistic complexity that helps people have authentic conversations, precisely because it's not obvious what an X person, right, would say and would decide. And the second link that's there is we're partnering with Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery to create case studies specifically about hard issues related to Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, and universities and legacies of slavery and colonialism more generally. And so the first one that we have there is actually a case study called A Forced Reckoning, specifically about the question of what should Harvard be teaching about its own history and legacy of slavery, and who should be expected to learn that. And so it is actually a way into our thinking and talking about these really hard issues, while simultaneously recognizing that students from different positionalities, that different schools, that et cetera, may have really different views about who needs to take on this responsibility and why. And so it's been interesting. We've started facilitating conversations about it. And they've actually been going really fascinatingly and well. And then the last thing I'm going to put in is just a resource for, like, so we started with the how do you set up the course and I use the Courageous Conversations Compass as one technique. Then how do you actually create conditions, like what instructional materials are there to talk about it in the classroom where you've planned it out? And one of the resources is these case studies. And then, though, there is this issue, what happens when things go south, right? And I know we're going to talk about that more in a minute. One thing I will say, with a shout out to the Ed Schools Teaching and Learning Lab, is they've put together a really amazing set of resources specifically for this that I find incredibly helpful. And so anyway, I'll unpack those a little bit more as we go on, but I wanted to give people the links to that too.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing the links. And Zara and I are going to try to put together some resources after this. So we'll make sure that we copy these in. And once we have it ready, we'll make sure that we'll work with Melissa and her team to distribute it to the participants. So we'll make sure those get in there, but it might be a while. So copy and paste those now into a Google Doc or wherever. I have to say, I actually participated, Mira, in one of your reckoning case discussions, the one that you did for DCE, and it was very powerful. It was really, I was very impressed, especially, I think, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself here and from my own experience, but there's so much polarization around so many of these topics that I imagine it must be really difficult to create case studies where you can actually let students flex their muscles and practice this. But I've never heard of the Courageous Conversation Compass, but I absolutely love it. I feel like, for those of us that lead teams, we should be doing this with our teams as well around work. And I want to do this with my family. I feel like every conversation I have with people lately could probably use a little bit of that. The naming of the responses, I'm sure will help. But we're already starting to get some really great questions coming in from the chat. So before we move into some prepared questions that Zara and I have, I just want to thank you all. Give a round of applause already, because I think there's just been so much really important information and techniques shared. So I just wanted to just stop and recognize that. I know we've already we've asked a lot of you, and so we're going to ask you some more difficult questions if you're willing to answer them. So Zara, am I forgetting anything? Is it okay for me to jump into the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. All right, so we've sort of prepared these, and in full disclosure, we prepared these. So Zara and I both work at DCE. We both work closely with faculty, and often we get questions from faculty around these topics. And so we've prepared these based on questions we typically get. But I should also say that we often get these questions after something has happened, right? So we hear from faculty after they've had a moment, and they haven't been fully prepared to respond to that moment. And so hopefully if the panelists don't mind, Zara and I are also going to put together some resources for our faculty based around this conversation so that we can get in front of them sooner, and so that they are actually prepared with those techniques before it happens to them. But that is a side note. We'll also share that as well. So one of the questions we get asked a lot, thank you, Mira, you've already alluded to this a little bit, is how to intervene when a discussion does go south. So meaning somebody said something offensive or problematic, someone is feeling hurt. So what tips can you all share with the group? And whoever wants to chime in first is welcome to. What do you do when things go south? Anyone want to go first? I'm a teacher, so I'll wait.
I'm happy to start, and in fact, at this point, to share what I think is a really just fantastic resource that Dr. Leah El-Amin and Kimberly Osagie developed some years ago through Harvard's Teaching and Learning Lab. And here is the link to the specific document that I think is really great. But one of the things that I think is really important is when things go south, recognizing that it's not only about managing the students, but it's also about managing oneself, right? And that oftentimes when we talk about this, we pretend that it's all about like how we are going to be the total experts in, addressing what's going on. But we are feeling things, we are thinking things, right? We have worries about who we're going to increase our standing with and decrease our standing with. We may feel really angry or upset about something that's been said or not said, or how a student is reacting, right? And so this actually gets back to the same sort of pre, during, and aftermath sort of framework that I use with the students. Is one of the things that I really like about this resource is that it starts by asking the educator, us as instructors, to do our own self-work and thinking about where are we likely to feel confused, triggered, frustrated, where are we going to be uncomfortable, what do we not know? And that if we don't do that work, it's going to be a lot harder for us actually then to do really great things in the moment. And that part of what we may need to do in the moment also is to stop and say, I need a moment here, or we all need a moment here. And I think, Carrie, I love the fact that you said I'm a teacher, so I can go with wait time, right? And this is something that's true. Educators or K-12 teachers really do learn about the importance of wait time as a way of helping us all process what we've been hearing. And only once we've processed, then be able to sort of take some ownership of it and then be able to formulate questions or responses. But also that wait time can be really important for doing some self-regulation, right? And there are tons of techniques that you can use just to give yourself a few minutes, as well as to give students a few minutes. You can simply say, can we take 2 minutes just to stop and think and process? Feel free to jot down any notes, or you might have something you specifically ask students to do. I'm curious how many of the rest of you are feeling the same way, or how did others hear this? I'm going to take 2 minutes to write down some things, and I'm going to ask you to read out one word or phrase that you wrote down, and we're going to go around the room. That can be a way to get a temperature check of, is this one student or is this a common experience? There's a whole bunch of resources on here that are very specific. Clarify misconceptions, use self-disclosure, use curiosity. Can you tell me more about that, right? Narrate what's happening. I want to thank you for that, but I also want to say that I see this other thing happening. Really concrete techniques that are part of what, again, in K-12 education, we call a pedagogical repertoire, right? It's our toolbox of techniques that we can bring in. So anyway, this is one resource that I think can be really helpful.
So helpful. Thank you so much, Mira. Before I turn it over to George, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I failed to mention at the start that V was kind enough to fit us in at the last minute, and she actually has a hard stop in about 2 minutes. So I wanted to just take a second to thank V and see, V, do you have any final thoughts before we let you go?
That's a big question.
Only a few minutes.
One, I just want to echo the resource that Mira just shared. In terms of that last question, I also think another approach is being okay with not feeling like you have to figure it out or solve it in the moment, and to communicate that to the students. So a lot of times when it goes down in class, what often is needed is a follow-up with maybe the students who disagreed, the student who might have said things. Sometimes we don't know until afterwards. Sometimes they'll tell us after class. Other students will say, hey, what that student did really harmed me. That, to me, I see as an opportunity where I'm like, okay, why didn't you speak up maybe in the moment? What might that look like? What is it that you would like us, right? Me, teaching fellows to do. So I also see that. I see that as an incredible learning opportunity. And then again, it goes back to then, well, what might you need, or what would you like to see? Would you like to have, discussions? A very very right restorative justice approach in many ways, where it's do we need to have a smaller group conversation first? If somebody says something that was outright offensive and that directly caused harm, what type of repair might be needed? So I want to name that sometimes the process might extend, and that there can be this need to want to figure it out in the moment, so that pausing, recognizing what comes up for me as an instructor, being transparent about that with students. Again, also saying that at the outset, I'm very open about my positionality, right? As a woman of color, the different ways in which a discussion around race, around gender, around reproductive rights, that's going to cause something different from me than it would from somebody else, right? With a different set of right intersecting identities. So I do think keeping that in mind, positionality, I would say, is the biggest piece of at the outset, because in that sense, neutrality is quite impossible if you are somebody who has to live and inhabit multiply marginalized and targeted identities, and you're expected to intellectualize a discussion that quite literally is a matter of life or death for you and your family members. That should be named. It doesn't mean, similarly to how I also discuss trigger warnings in a very particular way. I don't see that as a lot of times that can be used as a way to ask for the conversation to stop. And I try to frame it as an invitation to address an unhealed wound, right? Triggers are a sign of an unhealed wound. You can excuse yourself. However, you may also see it as an opportunity to then, right, explore. And that often is what happens in those those moments that when things blow up in class is usually because a trigger has occurred. And when a trigger happens, literally what is happening in the body and the brain chemically is you're going back to the moment that a trauma occurred. And so I think part of being, you know, a humanizing educator is not forcing anything in that moment. And maybe being able to name it, allowing maybe other folks in the class too. So like, is there anybody, you know, anybody want to respond, things like that, and being okay. And I think it's sometimes reminding everybody about the messiness, that it isn't designed to be a smooth ride. So, all right, thank you again for having, sorry I have to leave early, but I appreciate you all having me and hope to see everybody on campus soon.
Thank you so much.
All right.
That's a tough act to follow, George. Do you have anything you want to chime in with? Sorry.
Well, I mean, maybe just to emphasize some of the points that have been made already. I think the key thing is not to pretend that it didn't happen and to always follow up. It doesn't always have to be dissected in the classroom, but it does have to be followed up. Otherwise, these kind of issues will fester. I think these techniques that Myra and V mentioned about taking a break is very legitimate. I've done that in the past, saying, hey, we need 5 minutes to cool off. And depending on what the situation was, I've either talked to the students involved during that time, or I've made plans to talk to them later. To the extent possible, I would use it as a learning moment, which, if I understood her correctly, is what V was getting at, that this is a invitation to have a discussion, no matter how uncomfortable, because this is the only way people are going to learn. Even if someone takes a very offensive position, what I might consider a very offensive position, or even the majority of my class, I found, with rare exceptions, it usually comes out of a place of ignorance, not a place of malice, which opens the door for this conversation. Now, it may also come out of a position of malice, and we have to be realistic and cognizant of that. And I think one thing I would like to add is we should all know what resources there are for students beyond ourselves. I had an issue with a student that was facing, I think, pretty serious mental health issues. And I think we also have to know where our limits are. This has thankfully only happened once, but the student was very disruptive in class, very aggressive towards me and adversarial. But it turned out that this wasn't something I was equipped to deal with. And it was important for me to realize kind of where the boundaries I have as an educator ended, and where someone with more expertise in mental health or in student life had to take over. I just wanted to put that out there, because I think oftentimes we feel we have to solve all of these issues, and it's really critical to know when it goes beyond the skill set we have at our disposal.
Thank you so much, George. That's really helpful. I want to kick it over to Zara to ask one more question before we open it up to the group. Go ahead, Zara.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. So our question for you is, have you ever had an experience where a student felt disrespected by you as an instructor, or by another student when discussing some identity-related topics such as race, gender, sexuality, age, and religion? And how do you acknowledge that you may have misstepped or offended someone in the moment? And then I'm also going to tag on one of Kate Hamilton's great questions that you put in the chat, which is, and then how in these moments do you also regulate your own emotions? So I'll pass it to you, George and Mira, to answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to fill the silence. It's a technique I use, but I don't like to sit in silence. The only case that comes to mind recently, directly, I'm sure I've unintentionally offended students, and they've certainly unintentionally offended me, but in the past, the only case that comes to mind, if I'm being very honest, which I want to be with this group, was a situation where I felt my words were misinterpreted. And it wasn't actually a student, it was my TF in the class who reported this to me. And she had a personal situation which made her particularly reactive or sensitive to this. And she said that some students picked up on it as well. it was my either speaking too quickly or students not listening maybe as closely as they could. And that was a difficult conversation to have because I felt I was being accused of something I didn't feel I had intended to do. So it triggered all sorts of endorphin cascades or whatever you want to call it in me as well. But we just had a very honest and forthright conversation. And I think by the end of it, she realized it was not my intent to insult. And I realized better that I have to maybe not, I have to be a little bit more deliberate in how I present information. But I could well imagine this happening unintentionally in a class like the classes I teach. And I think in those circumstances, what really has to happen and what has happened with students in other cases is to diffuse the situation as much as possible. And generally for me, that means having a one-on-one discussion with them. I like to go to a neutral place. I don't like to meet in my office necessarily because that already sets up kind of a power hierarchy. And that's not my intent to say I'm the authority and your feelings are not valid. So I'd like to meet them in a more neutral place for coffee or water and just have a discussion. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not really answering the question, but that's sort of the best I have at the tip of my fingers at the moment.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, George, and also for sharing, the value of having those honest conversations, and then you just sharing with the student, okay, this wasn't, my intention, but I understand the impact that it may have had on you. Thank you. And Mira, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so before I respond to like what's happened when I've known about it, I do want to say I think that it is hard to know about times when students feel negatively impacted, right, by things that we say or do. And I think that that is in itself actually an important commitment that we need to take on as a commitment to being equitable and inclusive educators in a diverse setting. Because I mean, I know that there are lots of things that students will not say to me because I'm a professor and, I'm a senior professor and, this and that and the other thing. And so, I have experimented over the years with different kinds of approaches to try to sort of keep my ear on the ground a bit more. It used to be actually, this was following our now dean, Bridget Terry Long. She mentioned my first year here 15 years ago now as an assistant professor. She said that she used weekly check-ins, just a very, short kind of plus delta form with her students to find out from her students how they were finding class, what was going well for them, what they wanted help with. I did that for years. I found it very helpful because you really did get real-time feedback. And I experimented at different times with making it required to be anonymous versus optionally anonymous. And I'm happy to talk, later if you want to about the pros and cons of those different approaches. And it often gave me insight into how students were making sense of things that happened in the course or that I said or that another student said that I just didn't realize. At the same time, I've actually stopped doing that in part because I feel as if it makes me a little bit overly reactive. And of course, there are arcs to learning and to relationships and so forth. And I worry that as students, this is kind of like, there's research among juries that if you poll jurors at the beginning of their deliberations, what they think, if they guilty or innocent or whatever, they tend to get much more stuck in that position than if you don't pull them and you just start by having an open conversation, right? And so there's a little bit of me that was feeling, by asking my students to write down every week how they are feeling about the course and what's going well for them and what's going poorly, I kind of felt as if I was giving it these partially transient feelings, but also feelings that could change over time, a little bit more weight and stickiness than I meant to. So I now actually do a mid-course check-in that gives me some insight. And when I have TFs in my course, I rely on them much more. And I say, listen in, I'm not on their Slack channels. I'm not on their WhatsApp groups. I'm not on their text groups. You may not be either, but you might be. And if you are, you can tell me stuff. And in any case, people will just say things, in the cafeteria and the hallways around you that they won't say around me. And that helps me. And then very briefly, when I have had things go wrong, where a student has really felt wronged by me or misrecognized by me, as George said, I just take a lot of time. Right. I take a lot of time with them individually or the small group, whatever it is. And then I also try to make transparent to other students that I have taken that time and that I think that kind of time is worthwhile. It's sometimes a little hard because you need to respect privacy and confidentiality and so forth. But I do think that it's really important, even if the work that you're doing is, with an individual student, not with the class, that the class sees, and maybe this is just because I'm at an education school, and I think that no matter what we're teaching, we are also always teaching our students to be educators, right? So there might be a curious sort of recursivity here at the ed school that, doesn't apply to you if you're elsewhere. But I do think it is important to model for the students and to make it clear that, we take on responsibility as educators to work through this, regardless kind of what you think is the right or the wrong thing, right? That at some point that becomes almost secondary to the repair of the relationship.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mary, for sharing the time that you take to reflect yourself as an educator, but also the time that you also take to, spend time with your students in groups and also one-on-one, which is really important. So now we're going to take time to open it up to our participants to ask questions. I also see some things coming that have come in through our chat. So one of the things that people have also messaged us also directly and also have been showing up is also the concept of being reactive versus responsive. So if George and Mira, if you can kind of elaborate a little bit more on what is when it's appropriate, is it appropriate to be reactive? And then when is it appropriate to be responsive? And what's kind of, how do you kind of oscillate between both of those things?
My sense is that it may be that in the back channel chat, is there an operative definition that you're working off of with the reactive versus the responsive definition?
I think somebody had wanted to know if it's, if the word reactive is appropriate within this context of having these kind of conversations.
Yeah. All right. So, I'm happy to start with that, right? I think that is, I think what we want to try to do is move from being reactive to being responsive, right? And that's part of the reason that I was talking about the importance of doing some of the reflection and self-work beforehand, right? Because I think that places us in a better space to be responsive, both because we've thought about this more, and so we're going to be caught less off guard, and because we also then ideally have some of these tools and in our pedagogical repertoire to pull on. And I think that's also the reason to do things like take the time in the moment, to take, I said that I then take a lot of time with particular students, and I think it's important that time is a lot of listening, right? And not just, certainly, one directional conversation, talking, or even conversation for a while, right? Because and in my mind, I am a very intentional educator who has always thought very carefully about what I'm saying and doing, and I'm always therefore doing the right thing, right? And clearly when something goes south, that's certainly not how my students perceive it, right? And so I have to step back and hear what they are perceiving and experiencing. Because that is also learning, right? For me, This is actually, we're doing a project right now with the Chicago Public Schools on student voice. And CPS is thinking about how student voice is actually a form of data for educators. And so we're actually writing a case study for them right now about a student who fails, does badly on a science test and is like, you know, this test is stupid, like da, 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 and they go off on how dumb the test is, and about the ways in which that actually is an exercise of student voice that is informative and not one that you just should reject out of hand. Doesn't mean that necessarily the test is stupid or you shouldn't be testing kids in science or whatever, but we're trying actually, you know, in this case study that we're writing, to create the space for the conversation to think about when and how do we take students' responses to what we're asking them to do in schools and in classrooms seriously. And how are they trying to tell us what their experiences are, sometimes poorly, sometimes offensively, sometimes disruptively, whatever. And that feels really important for me too, right? So I do have to learn from my students how they are experiencing my classroom. And they may be experiencing it in a totally different way than I thought I was designing it. But I do feel, and I think this is the K-12 educator coming out in me, right? That's then partly my responsibility. I don't think that I can ever just put the responsibility on the student and say, well, you're coming into my classroom space wrong, right? It's my responsibility to create the context for learning that enables them to learn. Now, that doesn't mean that everything they have to say is right or that I have to change everything, right? But I do think that it's a mutual learning where the point is, as for me as an instructor, I construct the syllabus, I construct the lesson plans, I construct the office hours. I do all of this stuff in order to try to promote learning. And if I am failing at that, then that is something that I need to take on, even if I think I did everything right.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Mary, for sharing how you're kind of acknowledging that within your practice. George?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo that. It's not about what I think I'm doing, it's about the outcome, the way what I'm doing is interpreted among the students. I too am, I think I am a very intentional educator. It doesn't always work out that way. I have to admit, I found this distinction between reactive and responsive interesting because it took my mind to a different place. A response, of course, is a reaction, but the two words have a very different normative valence, right? Something that's reactive, I think many people will construe as more negative or less prepared, less intentional, versus responsive is something that has a more positive valence to it. And I think if I can, let me just urge people on this basis to think about the language that they employ in the classroom, particularly for loaded terms, you know, illegal immigrant versus undocumented, pro-life versus pro-abortion, these sort of things. That's something that I spend a lot of time actually talking to my students about, and talking to them about how even terms that kind of are in the popular parlance have this valence that it invokes emotively within some people that we don't always give credit to. So I actually like to name things multiple ways and say, look, this is how we could call this particular idea. And that is something I spend a lot of time talking to my students about, is how to be very deliberate in the language that we use. So I guess I'm trying to prime them to head off these kind of negative responses that can arise. Oftentimes, I think quite unintentionally, someone uses a term that maybe is in wide circulation, but someone takes offense at that. And I think if we have that pre-conversation, that dispels the kind of negative energy around that. So I suppose in a normative sense, that's me trying to be responsive rather than just reactive after the fact.
Can I chime in really quickly on this, Sarah? Because George's comment about this reminded me that we actually, so one of the things that I do is head up this thing called Instructional Moves, which is an effort to try to make great teaching at Harvard visible and to help all of us become better teachers. And we actually just unveiled a new module on educating for equity and inclusion that I'm really proud of, that was funded by HCLIF, which we're really grateful for. And that I think is, I'm not sure that it uses the language quite of reactive or responsive, but I think it actually offers some real tools for thinking about how to be a responsive educator in this respect. So I've stuck that in the chat too.
And thanks for sharing all these great resources. And then, so now we're going to open it up to, well, we're going to ask participants also to unmute themselves to ask questions. But I just want to, before we do that, I'm going to just like quickly look at the chat. We have a few comments that have come in. I just want to read out Nuru Stracy's comment, which is, isn't it dangerous to always assume that someone else's sensitivities are a result of their situation? Surely it can also be a lack of empathy, understanding, and situation of the instructor so that learning occurs at a deeper level for the instructor as well. So I just want to know, you know, Mira and George, how that comment kind of sits with you.
Yeah, I had seen that as well as seen, you know, Kate's question earlier. And I think both of those I was trying to respond to in part by talking about I think taking a listening stance and so forth. So yes, I agree with Nura on that.
I suppose I agree for the most part as well. I try not to assume things about my students. I find assuming things is really pedagogically a harmful thing to do. I try to meet them where they are, and I try to let them explain to me where they're coming from. So yeah, I think often it is situational, not always. But again, I think it behooves us to sort of meet students where they are and not put assumptions into place based on race, gender, whatever other categories you may be not judging them by, but seeing them through, I suppose.
Yeah, well, thank you both for sharing that. And now we're going to invite, we have like a few minutes, so we're going to invite any participants if you would like to unmute yourself to ask a question. You can either unmute yourself or you can ask the question in the chat box.
Thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I've been like taking notes like intensely here. So I appreciate this. One of the questions I have, and just to put this question into context, is I am teaching the psychology of good and evil, which you can only imagine how that might go, right? So one of the questions I have is, it seems like, and I know this from data I collected in terms of individuals' political leanings and things like that, academic settings can be a little bit more homogenous in terms of political leanings or things that people support. And I was wondering if you had any strategies or suggestions to kind of encourage students that might have views that don't align with what they might think the majority or normative view might be, so that they're, you know, courageous and that they feel comfortable in voicing opinions that maybe they think are very contrary to the majority of their peers.
I have two things that I'll chime in about. One is my colleague, Marty West, often at the beginning of his course, asks, surveys students using like Poll Everywhere, or, you know, something that like makes the responses anonymous but visible, about their stances on specific policy issues. He teaches ed policy, and it's often really helpful to students to see how diverse they are actually in their specific policy beliefs, even if in fact the vast majority of our students at the ed school would, you know, skew from center left to far left radical, right? And so actually normalizing, helping students recognize that there's actually a lot of intellectual diversity there that they may not recognize, that they may not know, but it's like one level under, can be helpful. And I do think that the poll, like an online poll where they see, oh, okay, so we do have diversity of viewpoints, can be really helpful. The other thing, the technique that I use often, particularly when it's a really hard conversation that may bring up a lot of emotions, that is likely to, seems more likely even than usual to explode, is I use a technique I learned from originally from Facing History and Ourselves. That they call big paper. It can also be called text on text. What we do is we take, say, quotations, images, charts, whatever it is, pieces from the text that students have read, print them out in fairly large font and put them on a piece of chart paper in the middle, put the chart paper around the room, and then have, often this is also called the silent conversation. For say the first 25 or 30 minutes, students go around with their pens and they talk about the texts, but through writing. And they start out talking solely about the text themselves, because each of them may be at a separate chart paper to begin with, or they may have 2 or 3 at a chart paper. But then over time, the conversation becomes threaded, right? Because they're responding to one another and you see a conversation happen. What's nice about that is that students get to be semi-anonymous. I point out if they have an unusual pen color or really distinctive handwriting, they can't count on being totally anonymous, but they're at least semi-anonymous. They get a chance to get their ideas out in a little more thoughtful of a way than they might be if they're just talking. They can go back and they can actually edit, they can, add on and so forth. And it's another way to get a diverse array of viewpoints. And so I tend to do that, like in the course that I taught last month, our day on schools and colonialism. And we were learning about the Native American boarding schools in Canada and in the US, and and we were reading also the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery report. And these were really high stress, high emotion texts. Being able to pull those out and give students an opportunity to have that kind of conversation in writing first is really helpful. Again, it can be called text on text, silent conversation, big paper. I can put the link in to the chat. And I will say that when we were on Zoom, we did this actually on a Miro board. And I'd be happy to share the pictures of our Miro boards if you want to email me. It worked really, really, really well. The anonymity feature doesn't exist because the cursors, follow you along. So again, you're only semi-anonymous, but it worked beautifully on Miro.
Yeah, I think we're probably over time, but just very quickly, I mean, there's a term for this. It's preference falsification. And we see this quite often in classrooms. I have basically 3 strategies for this. The first is to, at the beginning of the class, talk about the assumptions people in the class have. And we do this as a group. We talk about, so what do you think, what background views do you think classmates would bring to this? And I don't ask them for their own views. I ask them to think about what they know about the Harvard setting, whether they're in the extension school or whether they're in the college. This will differ. But I ask them, what are their stereotypes about Harvard? And what are their stereotypes about me and the kind of topic of the class? That's very often a helpful way for getting a discussion going about difficult issues that people just assume everyone else feels a certain way about. And often, even in a, let's say, Harvard College classroom where the opinions are much more homogenous politically, oftentimes than in the DCE, let's say, there still is a continuum of opinion here. I also think being intentional in what we assign on the syllabus is quite important. There are works that I find lend themselves very well. So I'm thinking in particular, when I do religion and politics, there's a work by a Berkeley sociologist called Strangers in Their Own Land that I assigned because she's very empathetic. She self-identifies as very liberal, but she talks to a lot of people in the Deep South who identify very much with kind of the MAGA movement and so forth. And finally, I do what I call exercises to empathize. And I ask people, assuming that everyone's operating in good faith, why they think other people operating in good faith might assume a political position or a policy stance that is antithetical to what they may believe, right? So again, this kind of goes back to this idea of asking people to put themselves in someone else's shoes with there being this remove that they are not speaking for themselves. It's something I'm assigning them to do. And I find that really opens the discussion. I think students tend, in my experience, to be much more willing to come out and share more about their actual views. But they don't have to if they don't want to, right? This is an academic exercise. This is not an exercise in revealing who you are politically necessarily.
Well, thank you, Mira and George, so much for sharing your insights with us. And also a big thank you from Carrie and I to all our participants for joining us today. And we hope to see you again soon. So this is not goodbye. We're going to be in touch with an online resource and also a way to continue our conversation together. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
so
having me.
much.